Stuart Mill and the harm principle. John Stuart Mill was born in 1806 and lived until 1873. He was a British philosopher, economist, and civil servant, and is seen by some as the most influential English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century. His views have roots in the work of John Locke, David Hume, and Jeremy Bentham, but he developed original and brilliantly written defenses of liberal political views regarding morality, speech, society, and culture, and his work was and remains widely read. Mill's book, System of Logic, published in 1843, established his name as a philosopher. This work revitalized the study of logic and was very influential as an account of the philosophy of science. In 1851, he published the excellent and probably underappreciated Considerations on Representative Government. We'll discuss that book later in the course. But his three best-known works are On Liberty, published in 1859, Utilitarianism, published in 1861, and The Subjection of Women, published in 1869. From 1865 to 1868, he was a member of Parliament of the United Kingdom, representing the City of Westminster. During his time as a member of Parliament, he advocated easing the burdens on Ireland, and in 1866, Mill became the first person in the history of Parliament to call for women to be given the right to vote. He was an advocate of significant social reforms, including arguing for labor unions and farm cooperatives, and arguing for the abolition of slavery in the United States. In an 1862 essay, The Contest in America, Mill wrote about the question of whether the North and South in the United States should go their separate ways over the issue of slavery. In response to the idea that they should be allowed to, because that is what people in the South wanted, he said the following: "Suppose, however, for the sake of argument, that the mere will to separate were, in this case, or in any case, a sufficient ground for separation. I beg to be informed, whose will? The will of any knot of men who, by fair means or foul, by usurpation, terrorism, or fraud, have got the reins of government into their hands? Before admitting the authority of any persons as organs of the will of the people to dispose of the whole political existence of a country, I ask to see whether their credentials are from the whole or only from a part. And first, it is necessary to ask, have the slaves been consulted? Has their will been counted as any part in the estimate of collective volition? They are a part of the population. However natural in the country itself, meaning in the United States, it is rather cool in English writers who talk so glibly of the 10 millions of white Southerners to pass over the very existence of 4 millions of enslaved people, who must abhor the idea of separation. Remember, we consider them to be human beings entitled to human rights." So this was Mill talking about this argument that people living in the South should be free to decide to break off from the United States if that's what they wanted. But at the time, people talking about this weren't thinking of what the people who were enslaved wanted. Mill highlighted this in this passage, in this essay. So later in the course, we'll discuss concerns about freedom, autonomy, and self-government, as well as important issues of the definition of political community and who's entitled to political participation and political power. Here, Mill makes what most of us would take to be an obviously correct point, but one that was certainly not universally endorsed at the time in which he was writing. So in these ways, Mill was something of a progressive. On the other hand, Mill was an employee for the British East India Company for decades and argued in support of what he called a benevolent despotism with regard to the colonies, including India. His views here seem deeply misguided and racist, although they were certainly prevalent in the society in which he was living. And these views seem in sharp tension with other commitments of his, including with the harm principle, which we'll talk about in a moment. So in an essay published in 1859, A Few Words on Non-Intervention, he wrote, and I quote, "To suppose that the same international customs and the same rules of international morality can obtain between one civilized nation and another, and between civilized nations and barbarians, is a grave error, and one which no statesman can fall into, however it may be with those who, from a safe and unresponsible position, criticize statesmen. Among many reasons why the same rules cannot be applicable to situations so different, the two following are among the most important. In the first place, the rules of ordinary international morality imply reciprocity, but barbarians will not reciprocate. They cannot be depended on for observing any rules. Their minds are not capable of so great an effort, nor their will sufficiently under the influence of distant motives. In the next place, nations which are still barbarous have not yet got beyond the period during which it is likely to be for their benefit that they should be conquered and held in subjection by foreigners. Independence and nationality, so essential to the due growth and development of a people further advanced in development, are generally impediments to theirs. The sacred duties which civilized nations owe to the independence and nationality of each other are not binding towards those to whom nationality and independence are either a certain evil or at best a questionable good. So there's much that could be said about this passage from Mill and Mill's discussion here. I mention it for a few reasons. One, I think it's worth noticing the sexist and racist views that some great thinkers and even enlightened and ahead of their times thinkers have had, in part to show that they too are human and flawed, in part to show that even very thoughtful, smart people can have some very small-minded or flawed views. So there's no doubt that Mill was brilliant and innovative and had progressive views about women's rights and women's suffrage, among other things. But he still had surprisingly poorly thought out and retrograde views about other things, such as the colonial power and the colonial relationship. Second, it's worth reflecting on how some of our views, which we hold very confidently, are likely to be mistaken. Indeed, it's plausible that future generations will look back on some, maybe many views of ours as immoral, prejudiced, simplistic, misguided, and so on. And what's more, they'll be right about this. This provides an excellent reason to try now to identify those views that we might be wrong about, and to be open to changing our views. Indeed, it's worth thinking about how many of us may still see some human beings as barbarians in the way that Mill did. Finally, I think it's useful to juxtapose what Mill says about the state and the appropriateness of colonial despotic relations with what he says in his classic work, On Liberty. So, in the introductory section of On Liberty, Mill articulates what has come to be called the harm principle. He writes, "The object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. That principle is, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant." So this principle has been very influential in thinking about the proper role of the state and the boundaries on what the state can permissibly do. But it's in many ways in stark opposition to his much more paternalistic attitude toward people living in what were then British colonies. So in the next segment, we'll discuss this harm principle in more detail, trying to see what it suggests about the state's proper role and the role of the state in promoting happiness or well-being.